Hi, I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. This video about mites and mite treatments and mite treatment strategies is probably one of the most important videos, if not the most important video I've made to date. The reason being is that so many colonies die from mites and mite-related illnesses that if you do nothing else with the videos that I'm doing here, go watch this one, watch it again, and watch it again until you've taken on board what I'm trying to say, because really this is the key to having your bees survive. This is the way that I deal with mites in my apiary. I will go over the whole process, but first of all I want to go over the generalities of the mite itself and the basic strategies for beekeeping survival, if you like. Because really for me, this is do or die in terms of your beekeeping. There's two main thrusts to mite control in the apiary. One is the preventative method, the prevention, and the other is intervention. And I'm going to do it a little bit back to front. I'm going to talk about right now the intervention, because this is where most beekeepers let themselves down. And if you have lost a hive to mites, or if you're new to beekeeping, this is probably one of the most important videos you'll have watched. What mites do is, mites are a parasite. And as the parasites go, they are a bloody big parasite. That's the Varroa mite. The Varroa mite, if I had a Varroa mite, it would be this big on me. It would be the same as having something like a 7-pound cat attached to you, sucking your juices from you. It's going to make you damaged in terms of it will have made a wound there. It's reducing the bees' reserves for survival, and on the whole, a parasitized honeybee is going to live about 1/3 less long than a normal worker bee, an unparasitized bee. So that's taking, and most of that lifespan comes out of the field bee, the end of the life of the bee. So the last 4 to 6 weeks of the bee's life is now being reduced to about 2 to 3 weeks in order to, because of parasitization. But by no means is that the worst part. The worst part of the mite is that they, just like a tick can give us Lyme disease, mites bring in viruses into the hive. And there's a multitude of viruses that get into the colony this way, and it's usually those viruses that lead to the decline and eventual collapse of the colony. A lot of what we've heard about in the press about bees dying and the decline of bees is a lot to do with the way mites are being dealt with in the hives and the way things seem to be changing a little bit, and I'll come back to that in a bit. So the direct damage is bad, but the viruses are the really big problem. And 80 to 90% of colonies, certainly in Maine, if they die in the year, 80 or 90% of them are as a direct result of mites. So 8 or 9 out of 10 chances out of 10, your colony, if it died, had an issue with mites. It may not be the mites that eventually killed off the colony. Very often in the winter, the mites weaken the colony to such an extent that the cold eventually finishes them off. But even if the conditions were perfect, the bees would have died just because of the decline from the mites. So do not underestimate the damage that the mites can do. So first a bit about the life cycle of the mite. The more you understand about the mite and what it's doing, the better you're going to be able to control them, and the better you'll be able to get rid of them when it comes to the time of needing to get rid of them. So we start off with the founder's mite, an original mite that gets into onto the comb, and it seeks out larvae which are just about to pupate. So larvae that are about 8 days old or so are prime targets, and the 9th day, when that larva is about to pupate and become what would refer to as capped brood. That mite will go into that cell and attach itself to the larva, while the larva then starts spinning its silk cocoon, and it's in a capped cell, and now it's safe for being removed by nurse bees and what have you. But that's when the mite starts to do its damage. It'll chew a hole inside the larval skin and inject its salivary products in order to extract the fats and the juices from the bee larvae. And in doing so, they inject those viruses. About 60 hours after the larva starts pupating, the mite lays an egg which becomes male, and about 30 hours later it produces another egg which is female, and about 30 hours after that it'll produce another egg which will also be female, and 30 hours after that another egg which is going to be female. And those brother and sister mites will mate with each other. And in doing so, you've ended up with basically a genetic copy of the original foundress mite, because there's no mixing of genetics from one different mite to another different mite. It's all within the same, it's brother and sister mating with each other. And as a result, if that foundress mite had been the survivor of a chemical treatment, that means that all of her offspring are now going to be survivors of a chemical treatment. And this is how we build up a population of mites which are resistant to the treatments that we use to try to kill them off. And over the decades that we've had mites in this country and around the world, we've seen them become tolerant to all sorts of different chemical treatments that have been tried because of this strange breeding life cycle that the mite has. It builds in basically a capacity to develop chemical resistance in a population really quickly. And so that's one reason why it's so important to pay attention to both how we treat for mites and what we're using to treat the mites. And very important to follow the labels of those mite treatments strictly, because something as simple as leaving an old treatment in a hive over the winter, particularly synthetic treatments, leaving that in there over the winter, not taking it out, leads to very small traces of these chemicals being left in the hive, and mites are still reproducing when there's a bit of brood there, and the low dose is not enough to kill the mite, but and the mite is still able to breed, and so now it's becoming more and more, the population will gradually become resistant to the chemical, and that's how those populations grow. So very important to follow the instructions of your mite treatments, or you could be contributing to long-term problems for the bees. Having said that, the treatments that I'm going to talk about in this video are not known to be particularly vulnerable to these types of mutations and passing on, but better safe than sorry. Follow the directions of the treatments and you won't be contributing to a problem in the future. Every hive is going to get mites. They will come from a variety of sources. Occasionally, bees will encounter each other on a flower in the field, and a mite will pass from bee to bee. It's not really, that's probably a very, very, very low percentage of how mites get into the hive. The bulk of mites get into the hive from, well, probably number one is the reproduction within the hive. So any mites that are in the hive in the first place reproduce, and we've got more mites, so that's number one. But number two is bees. The beginner may not be realized, but bees will drift from one hive to another. Now, some times of year this is worse than other times of year, but bees aren't 100% fixed on staying in their own hive. There is an element of drifting from one hive to another. It's a low percentage, but when you're talking about tens of thousands of individuals in the colony, a low percentage can mean quite a significant movement of bees from one colony to another. This is particularly true of drones. Drones, because the guard bees of the hive are not really worried about whether drones are coming in to steal food. The worst a drone's going to do is go in there and have a tummy full of food, and that's it. But basically it's in the colony's interest to be hospitable to other drones as well, because they want a healthy population of drones should a new queen need to go out on a mating flight. So bees tend to allow drones to drift from hive to hive without inhibition. And as we'll talk about later, drones in particular carry many more mites than worker bees. And the reason for that is that the drone larvae, the drone as it's got a much longer pupating phase than the worker bee does. The worker bee has a 12-day pupation phase. The drone has about a 15-day pupation phase. And that means that whereas when those mites are laying eggs and there's more and more eggs being laid, with the worker bee, 1 to 2 mites will survive to adulthood and emerge with the bee, whereas with drones it'll be 1 to 3 mites will emerge. And so really there's roughly a 50% increase in the number of mites that are produced from drone larvae than there are from worker larvae. And that means the movement of drones is a particularly prime source for bees, mites to move from colony to colony. So our hive, and we can't stop that, so we may be able to stop the reproduction by killing off the mites in the hive, but the drifting of worker bees, the drifting of drones will bring more mites back into our nice clean hive. Then in particular, before we go on to the final one, but the drifting of worker bees, that becomes more and more acute depending on the stress that a colony is under. And I'll come to that in just a minute. But one way in which there's a lot of mites transferred, and they can be transferred extremely quickly, is when a colony is being robbed or doing the robbing. Your nice clean hive that you treated for mites 2 days ago and you've got next to no mites in your hive has now discovered a colony that's dying from mite overload. And there's a load of honey in there free to be stolen. And so your bees go in there, start stealing honey, but in doing so start picking up the mites from this colony that's heavily infested with mites. And they're bringing mites back on these trips back to the colony. And in the fall, mites can be transferred extremely rapidly that way. So late in the season, all these issues get worse and worse and worse. The buildup of mites in a colony in the fall is much more acute. Number one, the population of the colony is dropping down. Now, the mites have been building up through the summer, but the population of bees is now going down. That means the percentage of bees with mites is going right up very quickly. Drones are getting kicked out of all the colonies at that time. And so you've got a huge amount of drifting of drones from a colony that started to kick out its drones early to colonies that are leaving it a little later to kick out their drones. And so there's a big influx of drones looking for a home because they can't get into their original home. And remember, drones carry more mites. Colonies that are dying from mite overload, there's also quite a significant exodus of bees from that colony, not just to die, but there seems to be a significant drift of worker bees from colonies dying from mites. And there's been a lot of studies done on the drifting of bees from hives, particularly in the fall. But also, of course, that robbing. Colonies that are dying from mite overload, their population is going down, leaving them very vulnerable to robbing. Healthy hives come in to steal the honey, and bingo, the mites are being transferred to all those colonies that are stealing the honey from that hive. And so this is a very significant and a very rapid influx of mites, just when it couldn't be a worse time to happen. Because in the fall, it's critical that we get the mite levels low. 2 main reasons. One is from about late here in Maine, from August till they stop laying brood, they're rearing a different kind of worker bee. Instead of the normal summer worker bee, believe it or not, there's 2 types of honeybee. In the spring and summer, they produce a relatively small worker bee, whose job is to grow the colony, get the numbers up, collect food, store up food. But during the fall, it's a much fatter worker bee that's produced, because these bees are expected to hunker down and survive being locked up in the wintertime. So the bees in the fall that are produced are particularly fat, and they carry those reserves with them through the winter to survive, and into the spring to produce a new population of bees in the spring. So it's particularly important for our colonies not to have hives that are infested with viruses just at this time when we're producing all those overwintering bees. So we really have to protect those overwintering bees. But the other issue is that we're just about to go into that stressful time. So again, it couldn't be worse to get have a rapid infestation of mites and the viruses they carry in the fall, because we're just about to go into a time of year which is guaranteed to be stressful for the bees. And what those viruses do, not just kill the bees outright from the mites and the viruses, but they also lower those bees' immune system, and they lower the bees' ability to cope with stress. Both the viral problems that the bees bring in, but also the stress of surviving the cold, etc. And so it couldn't be a worse time of year for the mites to get out of control in the hive. So it's particularly important that we understand that our aim is, number one, keep mite levels low generally, but number two, make sure those mites are particularly low going into the fall while the colony is preparing for that most stressful time of year, a main winter. This problem seems to be getting worse. In the early 2000s, you could probably get away with treating your colonies for mites once in the fall, and that would usually be enough to have a pretty high survivorship of the bees during the winter. If you didn't treat, chances are your colony would die. But if you did treat, chances are probably about 75%, 80% that your colonies would live. And that required that one treatment in August, maybe September. But as it went later on, it became apparent that treating just once wasn't enough for my bees. I was losing bees regularly, losing colonies over the winter time. And this coincided with things like colony collapse disorder being in the news, and the survival rate of bees going from about 85% or 75% down to about 50%, 60%, 40%. It was getting really much harder nationally for bees to survive the winter. That's when the real red flags were starting to fly. I did my own test at that. I did my own test with my mite treatments at that stage. So I wanted to explore this myself because I felt that one mite treatment wasn't enough. And so I started to do a different series of things with my different apiaries. So I had more than one apiary at that stage. I had 5 yards. So I started to do some tests, and I had 5 different apiaries to do some tests with. And this, to me, really illustrates the need for more than one treatment, and for me to, at that time, to change the strategy I was using to control my mites. I had 2 yards. Together, between them, there was 10 colonies, and I treated them once in the fall for mites. I had another 2 yards. Between them had 14 colonies, and I treated them once in the summer, late summer, and once in the fall for mites. And I had 1 yard which had 40 colonies in it, and I treated it once in the summer, once in the early fall, once in the late fall. So all of these had the same kind of mite treatment. They had the same general feeding and that sort of thing, generally the same care. The honey flows weren't particularly different from 1 yard to another, and I was never experiencing anything different through the summer. But I had a very different experience with the survivorship. The yards I treated only once, all died. Every single colony died. The colonies I treated twice, once in the summer and once in the fall, 50% of them survived. So I had 7 out of 14 survive. And the 40 hives that I treated once in the summer, once in early fall, once in late fall, they had 75% survivorship. This really demonstrated to me the need to revise what I was doing. Now, certainly, the most important thing that you can be doing with your mite treatment regime is sampling. Sampling the colony to find how many mites you've got in that colony is probably the second most important thing that you can do apart from treating them. Okay, if we're sampling our bees, use one of these. Easy Mite, Easy Check for Varroa. There's a number of different things you could do with a homemade mason jar with a piece of hardwire cloth, but I'm going to show you how to do it with this. This is a very simple method. but there's a number of different things. We call it the alcohol wash method for sampling mites. You start off by going into your brood chamber of your colony and picking out a brood comb with lots of open brood on it. Now, the only difficult thing about this for some beekeepers is making sure that your queen is not on that particular frame. Ideally, what you do is, as you're going through your colony, once you find your queen, get straight on to doing your mite check. So let's say we've gone through our colony, we've got our queen, she's still in the hive. We'll take another frame of brood, which has lots of open brood. Open brood is important because that's the frame that's going to contain the most young nurse bees, the most recently hatched young adult bees to come out of their cells. They will have the most recent representation of the number of mites in the hive. So we have a frame of bees which does not contain their queen. We take that frame and we give it a shake into a container like this. And the funny thing is that you'd assume, okay, you shake it, you'd assume the bees fly out. Well, that will happen with about half the bees. And I'm going to do a video like this during the summer and you'll see the difference. But you shake the frame in here, the bees drop into the tub. The bees that fly out, these are field force bees. These are the older bees. They're 2 or 3 weeks old. They're not the young nurse bees that we want. The young nurse bees are going to stay in here. They don't even fly yet. They'll crawl all over the tub, and if you tap it down, they'll just form a puddle down here and they'll start crawling again on the tub. They won't fly, they'll stay in here. Before you've taken that frame out, what you do is you take your sampler, you take some isopropyl alcohol. You can do it with winter screen wash. Basically, fill this up with alcohol up to the lower line. So that's up to just below this mesh cage. If you take a half cup measure and you scoop up those bees from your tub and fill it up, drop them in there, you drop them in the alcohol and cover it up. Now this is going to kill those 300 bees. That's why you don't want the queen in here. But it's compared to the number of bees that the colony is rearing, about 2,000 a day. That's less than 1 in 7 that's only about 1 in 7 of the bees that were produced that day are killed in this process. So it's a price well worth paying to get an accurate sample of how your bees are doing for mites. So you've got alcohol up to about here. You've just put a half a cup of bees in that measure in this screen, and now you shake it all up. And you shake it for at least 60 seconds. Now what's happening now is the alcohol is going all over the bees. It's washing those mites off. The mites are killed straight away, just like the bees are. But the mites now let go of the bee and they drop off and they're getting rinsed off by the alcohol. And what will happen is the alcohol will the mite will float down in the alcohol, and if you tip this up, you're going to see the mites floating around in the alcohol down here because they got washed through the screen, the bees being held back. So now you're going to count them 1, 2, 3, and depending on the number of mites in that wash, it will tell you whether the mite levels are high or low or non-existent. If you've got less than 5 mites in your sample, in your half cup sample, the reason we did a half cup sample is because half a cup of bees is pretty close to 300 bees. So when we do our sample, we know that we've got very close to 300 bees in this sample. If we have 5 mites or less in that 300 bee sample, we're below the 3% mark. I'm sorry, the 2% mark in the hive. If we're below 2%, we're probably okay for now, and we don't need to treat. But once we're at 6 mites or more in a sample of 300 bees, we're now at 2% or more of the colony worker bees have mites. This is the point, this is called the threshold level at which we decide to treat the colony with some sort of treatment to kill mites. It means that any of our integrated pest management techniques now have not been sufficient to stop the mites getting up to this level. It's time that we have to take action. If we don't take action, in all probability, the colony will die. So 2%, or in other words, six mites per 300 bees, it's time to treat our colony. Once we're done with this, we can throw away the dead bees, and you can clean the alcohol by pouring it over a coffee filter and retaining the alcohol, because you can use it again and again and again until that alcohol is getting a bit too dirty to see the bees through. But you'll probably be able to get 6, maybe a lot more samples from that same alcohol. Sampling is really important, and it is a dilemma for some beginners, because a lot of you beginners will find it difficult to find the queen. And I understand that. Some mentors are a little less patient with people who have difficulty finding the queen, and they tell them you've got to sample in order to determine whether you need to treat for mites. But I know it's a fact of life that a lot of folks are not going to be able to find the queen, but you must not use that as a reason not to treat for mites. And so I'm saying something a little bit relatively controversial, and my view is that if you can't sample, assume that your mites are getting out of control according to a certain timetable. I would use this timetable as a fallback position. I would encourage you absolutely to learn how to do sampling and to have a much more accurate means of determining when is appropriate to treat for mites. But from many years of experience in sampling hundreds of colonies and treating hundreds of colonies, I can give you the format which I find here in Maine would give you a successful treatment regime. Because if I go into a yard with 30 hives and I find 3 or 4 of those hives have the mites up to a point at which it's time to treat, the thing that you should do is treat all of the colonies in that yard. And I'm going to give you a timetable that I find year after year, the samples tell me I have to do my treatments at this time. Use this as your fallback position. Here in Maine, what I do is I will treat my hive. I find that my hives are starting to need treatment by the last 2 weeks of July. So I almost always do my first mite treatment of the year that last 2 weeks of July, usually the last week of July. It takes roughly 1 month later before I'm finding colonies that need treatment again. Now, this might be because the treatments didn't work all perfectly the last time, but generally enough of the bees have found other sources of mites that I'm going to need to treat again by about the last week of August, first week of September. Then things change and I take the honey supers off the hive during September, and the bees are starting to produce less brood, but usually I find I will need to treat again, or I prefer to treat again by the end of September. And then as a precaution, I think that you should be looking at treating again before the bees stop flying, or by about the time the bees stop flying. And I'm just going through the theory, but the sampling that I do typically falls into this pattern. And so more or less treating end of July, end of August, end of September, and sometime in October. Usually the bees have stopped flying by that time, and they aren't going to be picking up more mites. Depending on the timing of when I got my first and second treatment in, it varies. My third treatment, it varies if I do a fourth treatment. But if the bees can still fly in November, and we have several warm flying days in November, I will go around and treat my hives again. Some treatments are much better suited to these late treatments than others. And so I'm going to go through with you again, which I did in a previous video called My Bees Are Gone. this, I'll go through again the mite treatments that I would use, but just to repeat, in the absence of sampling, work on the assumption that your bees are going to need treatment by the end of July, and probably need treatment pretty much monthly thereafter. I 100% encourage you to do samples to tell you do not treat. But I choose to use sampling. What you should use sampling to do is to tell you when you should treat. But from my experience, I tend to use sampling to tell me when I will not need to treat. Because of the number of colonies I have, typically I have 1 or 2 hives that need treating by these schedules. And so I have found that since I've adopted that strategy, I've gone from having 50 to 75% survivorship to 80 or 90% survivorship in all of my yards by adopting this strategy. And I really encourage you to look very closely at your mite treatment regime and really practice to try and get some sampling done accurately, but don't use the fear of damaging your queen because of your sampling as a reason not to treat for mites. If in doubt, treat. Now, there are 3 different treatments that I typically will use in my yard. They're all considered organic treatments. There's a 4th one that you could use, but I haven't tended to use it for the last decade or so. I used to use it when I was having relatively poor survivorship, so I've not been using it since I've been improving my methods and regime, and so I can't speak 100% for that treatment, but I can speak knowledgeably about these 3 treatments. During the summer, if I can, I will use Formic Pro to treat my colonies, because during the summer, number 1, you've got honey on the hive, and so you have to use a treatment which is okay for that. Number 2, you've got a lot of brood in the hive, and the only treatment that's particularly good with a lot of brood in the hive in this range is Formic Pro. Formic Pro will kill the mites that are outside the cell, but they'll also kill the majority of the mites that are in capped brood as well. With Formic Pro, there's 2 ways of treating. You use 2 pads in the colony, and you put them between your 2 brood chambers. You make sure the entrances are wide open so the bees can ventilate. But you can either use 1 pad for 10 days and replace it with the 2nd pad for the next 10 days. This is a pad laid between the 2 brood chambers. Alternatively, you can do it all at once and do both pads for 14 days. The thing that you must remember with Formic Pro is that you shouldn't use it if the temperatures, particularly over the first 3 to 4 days after application, are going to get above 85 degrees. If the temperatures do get above 85 degrees, you run a significant danger of losing your queen and excessive amounts of brood in the colony. But Formic Pro during the summer is my go-to treatment. I think it is a fantastic treatment. It works the vast majority of the times and typically will kill between 85 and 97% of the mites in the colony. It does a very good job of cleaning up the mites in the hive. But a lot of the times the temperatures are too warm for that. So under those circumstances, I'll use HopGuard. Now, HopGuard just come out with a new formulation called HopGuard 3, which I'm looking forward to, because HopGuard I've always considered as a poor substitute for Formic Pro, but a heck of a lot better than no mite treatment. HopGuard is a hops extract. It works by the chemical is in the juice within the cardboard strip that goes into the hive, and those contain potassium salts and beta acids which will kill those mites. Again, HopGuard is considered a organic treatment, and it's got a much broader temperature range. There is no upper limit, so you can use it up to 100 degrees and you can use it down to 50 degrees. Formic Pro, it's 50 degrees to 85 degrees. So on those days where the weather forecast is just looking too hot, I will use HopGuard instead of Formic Pro. Problem with this one is that it will not penetrate the brood. And so it works much better in colonies that do not have brood in them. But given that in the summer I do not want my mites to get out of control, I'll use HopGuard even though I've got brood in the hive, and accept the fact that I'm going to have a lower efficacy rate. It's going to kill lower percentage of the mites. HopGuard 3 is supposed to be considerably better than HopGuard 2. So HopGuard 3 is supposed to kill between 75 and 85% of the mites, as opposed to the sort of 50 to 75% that the HopGuard 2 would do. So I'm looking forward to using that and I'll feel better using that as a fallback during the summer. During the fall, when the honey supers come off, I use oxalic acid. But just in the last couple of weeks, oxalic acid's also been approved to be used with honey supers on the hive, which is a big change. So oxalic acid is something that we can now use during the summer as well. Problem with using oxalic acid during the summer, and we do this by vaporizing. The problem with using oxalic acid during the summer is oxalic acid does not penetrate the brood. And so whilst you'll kill the mites that are the mites that are free and loose on the bees themselves, the phoretic mites, it will not kill the mites that are in the brood. So if you were looking to get the mite levels really down, you would have to treat several times over a 12-day period with oxalic acid in order to be effective at killing off the mite levels to a very significant degree. But it's good to have that up our sleeve. It's another option. Again, with very little issues regarding temperature as well. Oxalic acid can be used right down to 37 degrees. As long as the bees aren't clustered really tightly, oxalic acid works very well. Oxalic acid is best used when there's no brood in the hive, and that's why it's an ideal fall treatment. Particularly those last treatments, mopping up the mites in the late fall. So whilst I will tend to use oxalic acid in late September, I will definitely use oxalic acid in mid to late October, by which time our hives have next little or no brood in them. Now a single dose of oxalic acid should be enough to mop up all the mites in the hive. And if you do get another flying day or flying week during November, go ahead and treat again with oxalic acid. Now you're really being successful at reducing the mites, because here in Maine, we've almost never have brood in the hive in November. So that is the treatment regimes that I will typically use: Formic Pro or HopGuard during the summer, oxalic acid once we're getting less and less brood to no brood in the fall. There's another treatment called Apiguard, which is a thymol-based product. This one tends to be a bit tricky because thymol will taint the honey in the hive. And so, number one, it means that you can't use it with honey supers on the hive because you'll ruin your honey. And number two, if you did have honey in your brood chamber and your colony did die, you've tainted that honey, so you're not going to be able to extract a bit for yourselves anyway, because which a lot of folks do in colonies that have died out. Although it's not a great idea to harvest honey from the brood chamber anyway, it still eliminates that possibility. But Apiguard is a thymol gel. It comes in little aluminum trays that you put between the brood chambers. You put one tray in for 2 weeks, and then you take that out and put another tray in for 2 weeks. Again, one of the beauties of using oxalic acid in the fall is you don't have to open up the hive. And there's one thing I don't like doing with bees in the fall, and that's opening up the hive. So that's why I will choose in September and October and November to use oxalic acid vaporization, because then all we have to do is stick the wand in the entrance of the hive, or squirt the jet in the back of the hive or the entrance to the hive, and we don't have to open it up. And it does a great job of killing mites, particularly when there's no brood in the hive. I hope you found that helpful. Some of the things not everybody's going to agree with me about, but what I'm telling you is these are the methods that have worked for me. Follow the directions of the mite treatments. That the mite treatments come with directions for use. It's very important that you follow those directions and you keep to that. We're dealing with basically a pesticide, and it's our duty to use pesticides properly. We complain if farmers are using pesticides badly and hurt our bees. Well, if you use the pesticide incorrectly, you're hurting your bees. So follow the directions. These mite treatments are very important and are key to keeping our bees alive. I will do a video on integrated pest management techniques shortly, but for now I hope that if you found this helpful, go over it again, repeat it until you really understand it. By all means, contact me with questions or ask questions down below. And if you like what you find, let people know about the video. Please press subscribe, and just I hope you will find this something. I found this was the beginning of the real change for me in my beekeeping. Once you've got the knack of controlling the mite levels in your hive, your beekeeping is to be much more enjoyable, a lot less expensive, and much more rewarding. So I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. See you next time.